"Ma'am, if you walk away now, I don't think I'll make it home." Those words stopped Grace Miller in the middle of a freezing Chicago downpour, with the most important job interview of her life starting in 23 minutes, and a soaked elderly stranger barely able to stand beside a blue glass bus shelter. Grace stared at the time on her phone, 8:37 a.m., then at the resume inside the plastic folder clutched beneath her arm. At 29, Grace was a plus-size woman who had spent years learning how quickly strangers could decide who she was before hearing her speak. Too big for the polished front desk. Too ordinary for the luxury hotel. Too noticeable in all the ways people thought were wrong, yet somehow invisible whenever she needed someone to see how hard she worked. Today was supposed to change that. The Langford Hotel had invited her to interview for an assistant events manager position, paying nearly twice what she earned at the neighborhood diner, and Grace had spent 3 years building toward this chance. Then the old man collapsed against her shoulder. "Sir!" Grace dropped her folder and caught him before his knees struck the flooded sidewalk. He was perhaps 75, silver-haired, dressed in an expensive cream sweater now heavy with rain, but there was no driver, no umbrella, and no one stopping to help. Cars hissed through standing water while pedestrians hurried past. Grace called 911, but the dispatcher warned that storm-related accidents were delaying ambulances. The old man's hands trembled violently. "My medication," he whispered. "Apartment, 6 blocks." Grace looked toward downtown. Her interview was now 19 minutes away. She could still make it if she called him a cab and left. Her phone buzzed with an email from the hotel. "Final interview confirmation. Please arrive 10 minutes early." Grace swallowed hard. "Can you walk?" she asked. He tried and nearly fell again, so Grace crouched in the rain. "Get on my back." The man blinked. "You'll miss wherever you're going." Grace forced a smile even as something inside her cracked. "Then I'll be late." She carried him through 6 blocks of ankle-deep water, his arms around her shoulders, her white blouse plastered to her skin, her shoes ruined, every step stealing another minute from the future she had imagined. At 9:14, she finally got him into his apartment and found his medication exactly where he said it would be. At 9:20, Grace called the hotel. "Miss Miller," the recruiter said coolly, "we had 43 applicants. We cannot delay the panel." "I understand. We'll be moving forward with another candidate." Grace closed her eyes. "Thank you for considering me." She ended the call before the elderly man could see her cry. "You lost the job because of me," he said quietly. Grace wiped her cheek and shook her head. "I made the choice. You needed somebody." What she didn't notice was the old man staring at her with an expression that had changed completely. "What's your name?" "Grace Miller." He repeated it, as if committing it to memory. 5 hours later, Grace was back at the diner, serving coffee in borrowed clothes, while her manager complained that she was late. Then a black Rolls-Royce stopped outside. The entire diner seemed to go silent as a tall man in a rain-darkened black shirt stepped from the rear door. His name was Dominic Moretti, a 36-year-old Mafia boss whose wealth bought influence and whose cold reputation made dangerous men lower their voices when he entered a room. Dominic trusted almost no one, especially strangers who suddenly became helpful around his family. But that afternoon, he wasn't looking for an enemy. He was looking for the woman who had carried his father 6 blocks through a storm and asked for absolutely nothing. The diner door opened. Dominic's hard gaze swept across the room until it found Grace behind the counter. She froze. He walked directly toward her, stopped only a few feet away, and placed her rain-soaked resume on the counter, the resume Grace had believed she lost beside the bus shelter. "Grace Miller." His voice was controlled, almost frighteningly calm. She nodded. Dominic looked at her ruined resume, then into her eyes. "My father told me what you sacrificed for him this morning." Grace's face drained of color. "Your father?" Dominic leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear the next words. And now I need to know why a woman who had everything to lose was the only person in this city who stopped to save him. Grace stared at Dominic Moretti as if the answer he wanted should have been obvious. Because he needed help. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something sharpened behind his dark eyes. That's it. What else would there be? Around them, forks had stopped moving and conversations had dropped into nervous whispers. Grace's manager, Carl, suddenly appeared from the kitchen wearing the smile he reserved for wealthy customers. Mr. Moretti, what an honor. If I'd known you were coming. Dominic raised one hand without looking at him. Carl stopped speaking immediately. Grace noticed that. She also noticed the two broad-shouldered men standing near the diner entrance, watching every window and every customer. Whoever Dominic Moretti was, he wasn't simply a rich man searching for the stranger who had helped his father. My father says you carried him 6 blocks, Dominic said. In that storm. Grace picked up a coffee pot, uncomfortable with the attention. He couldn't walk. And you missed an interview at the Langford Hotel. Her hand froze. How do you know that? Your resume. Dominic tapped the water-stained pages on the counter. Grace's embarrassment returned instantly. Her entire failed morning was sitting between them in smeared black ink. Then you know enough. She reached for it, but Dominic placed 2 fingers over the folder. Not quite. His voice lowered. People have spent years trying to get close to my family. They offer favors because they expect something afterward. Grace finally looked directly at him. Are you accusing me of planning your father's medical emergency? One of Dominic's men shifted uneasily. Nobody spoke to Dominic Moretti that way. Dominic, however, almost smiled. Almost. I'm asking what you want. Nothing. Everyone wants something. Then maybe you've been meeting the wrong people. For the first time that day, Dominic had no immediate response. Grace took the resume from beneath his hand. Your father was scared. I helped him. End of story. She turned toward table 7, but Carl caught her arm. Grace, apologize. Her shoulders stiffened. For what? You're talking to Mr. Moretti like he's some guy off the street. Dominic's gaze dropped to Carl's fingers gripping her wrist. The temperature in the room seemed to change. Take your hand off her. Carl released Grace instantly. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. She works for me, Carl muttered. No, Grace said, rubbing her wrist. I work here. There's a difference. Dominic's eyes flickered toward her, and something in his expression softened for half a second. Then Carl scoffed. You should be grateful you still have a job after showing up 5 hours late. Grace's face burned as nearby customers looked over. I called. And I told you we needed you. You think everybody gets to abandon their shift because they want to play hero? Dominic slowly turned toward him. She was helping my father. Carl went pale. I didn't realize. Would it matter if he weren't my father? Dominic asked. Silence. That question landed harder than a threat. Grace looked at Dominic differently now. He could have frightened Carl. Instead, he had exposed him. Dominic pulled several bills from his wallet and placed them beside an untouched coffee. Her shift is over. Grace frowned. You don't get to decide that. His men looked almost alarmed. Dominic studied her for a beat, then nodded once. You're right. That surprised her more than anything else. Then I'm asking. My father wants to thank you personally. Grace hesitated. Is he okay? The hardness left Dominic's face. He is now. 20 minutes later, Grace sat inside the Rolls-Royce she had watched from the diner window, keeping as much distance from Dominic as the wide leather seat allowed. Chicago slid past beneath a grey afternoon sky. You always investigate people who help your family? She asked. Yes. That sounds exhausting. It keeps them alive. Something in his answer stopped her. For the first time, Grace saw what existed beneath the expensive clothes and controlled voice, a man who expected danger before kindness because life had taught him to. Dominic's phone rang. His expression changed as he listened. "Say that again." Grace watched his jaw tighten. He ended the call and immediately told the driver, "Turn around." "What happened?" she asked. Dominic looked at her. The security footage from the bus shelter came through. "And?" His eyes were colder now, but the cold wasn't directed at her. "My father didn't collapse by accident." Grace's breath caught. Dominic leaned forward. "Someone followed him for 3 blocks before you found him." Then he showed her a frozen frame on his phone, and Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She recognized the man standing beneath the black umbrella. She had seen him that morning too, and he had been watching her. Grace stared at the frozen image on Dominic's phone until the memory returned with terrifying clarity. "He was across the street," she whispered. "When I found your father, he was standing under that umbrella." Dominic's eyes locked onto hers. "Did he speak to you?" "No, but when I started carrying your father away, he followed us for maybe 2 blocks. The Rolls-Royce turned sharply through wet Chicago traffic as Dominic called one of his men. "Marco, lock down my father's building. Nobody enters or leaves until I get there. Pull every camera between the bus shelter and his apartment." He ended the call, then looked at Grace. "You're coming with me." Her spine stiffened. "No, I'm going back to work." "That man saw your face." "And?" "And if he targeted my father, he may believe you saw something you weren't supposed to see." Grace's stomach tightened, but she shook her head. "I already lost my dream job today, that's worth. I'm not losing the job that still pays my rent, because some stranger with an umbrella might remember me." Dominic studied her for a long moment. He was accustomed to fear opening doors for him. Grace's fear seemed to make her stand straighter. "Driver," he said finally, "take Miss Miller home." Grace blinked. "That's it?" "You said no." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her. He could command rooms without raising his voice, yet when she drew a boundary, he respected it. "But 2 men will stay outside your building tonight." "Absolutely not." "They won't bother you." "Dominic." His phone buzzed. A photograph appeared on the screen. This time even Grace saw his control fracture. It showed his father's medication bottle lying open beside several unfamiliar capsules. "Those aren't his pills," Grace said immediately. Dominic turned toward her. "You're sure?" "Yes. The ones I gave him were small and white. Those are blue." Dominic called his father's physician, and within minutes the truth became clear. Someone had tampered with one of Antonio Moretti's prescriptions before he left home that morning. The dosage was designed to make him dizzy and disoriented, vulnerable enough to collapse in public. "Why?" Grace asked. Dominic stared through the rain-streaked window. "Because my father is the only person besides me who can authorize a family trust transfer scheduled for tomorrow night." Grace felt suddenly very far from the ordinary life she had known that morning. So somebody wanted him out of the way, or wanted me frightened enough to make a mistake. Dominic's voice became dangerously quiet. Then another message arrived. A security photograph filled his screen, the umbrella man entering the rear door of Grace's diner 2 nights earlier. Grace stopped breathing. "I've never seen him inside." "Maybe he wasn't there for you then," Dominic said, "but he knows where you work now." Grace insisted on returning to the diner anyway. Dominic hated the decision, but he kept his word and let her choose. When they arrived, however, Carl was waiting beside the register with her purse and coat. "You're done," he announced in front of the customers. Grace stared at him. "You're firing me? You disappear for hours, then bring trouble back here? I don't need this." Humiliation burned through her, but Grace refused to beg. She took her purse. "Then give me my final paycheck." Carl laughed bitterly. "Always demanding something." Dominic stepped forward, but Grace lifted a hand. "No, I can handle this." She faced Carl herself. "I worked doubles when you were short-staffed. I covered Christmas morning. I stayed when my mother was sick because you said the diner needed me. I will not apologize for helping an elderly man who couldn't stand." The room fell silent. Dominic watched her with an expression Grace couldn't read. She wasn't powerful. She had no bodyguards, no fortune, and now no job, but she still refused to surrender her dignity. Carl tossed an envelope onto the counter. Grace picked it up and walked outside without another word. Dominic followed. Under the awning, Grace finally exhaled, fighting tears. Without speaking, he removed his black jacket and placed it gently around her shoulders. "I don't need saving," she whispered. "I know," he said. "That's not why I'm here." Before she could answer, Dominic's phone rang again. Marco's voice came through urgently enough that Grace could hear it. "Boss, we identified the umbrella man. His name is Victor Hale. He works for someone inside your organization." Dominic's face hardened. "Who?" There was a pause. "We don't know yet, but we found something else. Hale accessed Ms. Miller's employment records 48 hours before your father collapsed." Grace went completely still. Dominic slowly looked at her. The attack hadn't begun when she helped Antonio that morning. Someone had known exactly who Grace Miller was before she ever touched him. Then Grace's own phone vibrated. An unknown number. "Don't answer it." Dominic's voice changed instantly, every trace of softness disappearing as he took Grace's phone and studied the photograph. Rain hammered the diner awning while traffic moved behind them, but Grace suddenly felt as if the entire city had gone silent. "They knew where I worked before today," she whispered. "They knew about the interview." Dominic looked up. "What?" Grace pulled her rain-damaged resume from her purse. "The Langford interview wasn't public. I applied 3 months ago, and they contacted me privately. If someone accessed my employment records 48 hours ago..." Her voice trailed off. Dominic understood immediately. "Then helping my father wasn't the reason they targeted you." 20 minutes later, Grace was inside Dominic's secured downtown residence overlooking Lake Michigan, still wearing his black jacket around her shoulders. She hated needing protection, but Dominic had given her a choice. Police station, hotel under security, or his residence until they understood the threat. She had chosen the place where Antonio was recovering because she needed to see that the elderly man she had carried through the storm was safe. The moment Antonio saw her, relief crossed his tired face. "Grace, you scared me this morning," she smiled weakly. Antonio reached for her hand. "And you saved me before you knew my name." Dominic stood several feet away, watching them, his posture rigid until his father squeezed Grace's fingers. Then Antonio said something that changed everything. "Dominic, bring me the envelope from my desk." Dominic frowned, but obeyed. Inside was a photograph taken 18 years earlier, outside a small neighborhood bakery. A younger Antonio stood beside a smiling woman Grace recognized immediately. "That's my mother." Dominic looked sharply at her. Grace's mother, Elena Miller, had died 6 years earlier after a long illness, leaving Grace with medical bills she was still paying. Antonio nodded. "Elena worked for me." Grace pulled her hand away. "My mother worked at a bakery." "That bakery was mine," Antonio said. "Not officially. It was one of several legitimate businesses I used before Dominic took control of the family." Dominic's expression hardened. "Why have I never heard this?" Antonio's eyes filled with regret. "Because Elena discovered someone stealing from us. Not money, names, addresses, financial records. She brought me evidence, and I promised to protect her. Instead, she disappeared from our lives because she was afraid whoever betrayed us would come after her daughter." Grace's knees weakened. Dominic moved toward her instinctively, but stopped before touching her. He let her choose the distance. "My mother spent years looking over her shoulder," Grace whispered. "She told me it was anxiety." Antonio lowered his head. "She was protecting you." Dominic opened the envelope further and found an old flash drive taped beneath the photograph. "What is this?" "The evidence Elena gave me. I thought the problem died with the man we blamed." Antonio looked at Grace. "I was wrong." Dominic connected the drive to an isolated laptop. Files appeared, payments, coded names, property transfers, and one name repeated across records spanning nearly 2 decades. Richard Vale, Dominic's uncle and the man who had managed the Moretti family's legitimate finances since Dominic was a teenager. Dominic stared at the screen. My uncle sits beside me at every council meeting. Antonio's face tightened. And tomorrow night, when the trust transfer is signed, he gains temporary control if either of us is medically incapacitated. The pieces suddenly aligned. Antonio's altered medication, Grace's employment records, the umbrella man, her interview. Someone hadn't merely watched Grace, they had deliberately arranged for her to be away from her normal routine on the same morning Antonio was supposed to collapse. They wanted me at the Langford, Grace said. Dominic turned. Why? She studied the files, then remembered something. The final interview was moved yesterday. Originally it was next week. Dominic's phone rang before he could respond. Marco had traced the email. The interview invitation had been manipulated through an outside account connected to a shell company controlled by Richard Vale. Grace felt sick. I was supposed to be somewhere else when your father collapsed. Dominic's eyes went cold. Exactly. But why would anyone care whether I helped him? Antonio answered quietly. Because you weren't supposed to. Suddenly, every light in the apartment went dark. Emergency lamps flashed red along the hallway. Dominic crossed the room in one movement and positioned himself between Grace and the door. Stay behind me. A security alarm began screaming. Marco's voice burst through Dominic's phone. Boss, someone breached the service elevator. Grace grabbed Dominic's arm. Your father. Dominic looked toward Antonio's room and the sound of breaking glass exploded from the corridor. He pushed Grace behind a marble column, shielding her with his body. Then Grace noticed something. The elevator doors opened, and Dominic moved in front of Grace before the first man could step into the corridor. Behind me. His voice was low, controlled, absolute. Grace pulled Antonio back while Marco and 2 security men rushed from the opposite hallway. For several breathless seconds, nobody moved. Then the elevator revealed not Victor Hale, but Richard Vale himself, immaculate in a charcoal suit, both hands visible at his sides. Dominic, Richard said calmly. Tell your men to stand down. Dominic didn't move. You picked a bad night to visit, Uncle. Richard glanced at Grace, and that single look confirmed more than any document could. He knew her. So Elena Miller's daughter finally found her way back to us. Grace felt Antonio tense beside her. Dominic's expression became glacial. You have 10 seconds to explain why you know her. Richard smiled. Because her mother nearly destroyed this family 18 years ago. She exposed you, Antonio said. Richard's smile vanished. She stole records she didn't understand. Dominic stepped closer, placing himself directly between Richard and Grace. And this morning? Your father was supposed to become temporarily unavailable. Nothing permanent. You would have delayed tomorrow's trust transfer, the board would have invoked the contingency clause, and I would have gained authority long enough to complete several transactions. And Grace? Dominic asked. Richard's eyes shifted past him. She was supposed to be interviewing across town. Unfortunately, she inherited her mother's habit of interfering. Grace's fear hardened into anger. You arranged my interview? I arranged an opportunity, Richard replied. You should have taken it. Dominic's jaw tightened, but Grace stepped from behind him. No, he looked back at her. Grace, he's been deciding where I'm supposed to stand my whole life without me even knowing it. She faced Richard. My mother spent years afraid because of you. Today you tried to move me around like a piece on a board. I'm done letting people decide that my life matters less because I'm easy to overlook. Richard gave a quiet laugh. You think courage makes you powerful? Grace held up the tracking device she had removed from Antonio's medication case. No, evidence does. Richard's face changed. Dominic noticed. Marco immediately sealed the elevator behind Richard. Grace looked toward the laptop. The tracker has a serial number. If it connects to the same shell company that manipulated my interview email, then we can prove this wasn't coincidence. Dominic's gaze stayed on Richard. Already checking. Richard suddenly reached inside his jacket. Dominic moved instantly, pushing Grace and Antonio behind the marble column as Marco restrained Richard's arm. What came out wasn't a weapon. It was a phone. On its screen, a countdown was running. Richard smiled again. You're focused on the wrong evidence. Dominic seized the phone. What happens in 11 minutes? The trust documents transmit automatically. Once they do, the money disappears through accounts your father will never recover. Antonio went pale. Dominic looked at Marco. Can we stop it? Not from here. Authorization requires the original security key at the Moretti Foundation office. That's 20 minutes away, Antonio said. Grace stared at Richard's phone, then at the old flash drive still connected to the laptop. A memory surfaced. Wait, my mother's files. She rushed to the screen. Among Elena's archived records was a folder labeled Foundation Recovery. Grace opened it and found a sequence of emergency authorization codes. She kept a backup. Dominic came beside her. Their shoulders nearly touched as the countdown reached 9 minutes. Can you use it? He asked. Grace shook her head. It needs 2 signatures, Antonio's and the acting head of the family. Dominic understood. Mine. Richard's confidence finally cracked. Those codes expired years ago. Grace looked directly at him. Then why are you scared? Marco verified the first code active. 7 minutes remained. Dominic entered his authorization while Antonio completed his. Richard began shouting for them to stop, but Grace never looked away from the screen. The transfer froze. At 41, every destination account appeared. At 017, Marco transmitted the records to the family's attorneys and financial crimes investigators. The countdown reached 0. Nothing disappeared. Richard's empire of secrets had collapsed because the woman he considered insignificant had noticed what everyone else missed. Dominic turned toward Grace, something warmer than gratitude breaking through his guarded expression. You just saved my father twice. Grace exhaled shakily. Your mother's evidence saved him. Your courage used it. Before she could answer, Marco's phone rang. His face changed. Boss, Victor Hale has Grace's home address. He's inside her apartment right now. Grace went white. Why? Marco listened, then looked at her. He's searching for something Elena left behind. Dominic reached for his coat. Then we face it together. 40 minutes later, Dominic's Rolls-Royce stopped beneath the flickering streetlight outside Grace's modest apartment building on Chicago's north side. The storm had weakened to a cold drizzle, but Dominic refused to let Grace enter until Marco confirmed Victor Hale was gone. Inside, her apartment looked as though a tornado had passed through it. Drawers overturned, cushions ripped open, photographs scattered across the floor. Grace stopped when she saw a framed picture of her mother lying beneath shattered glass. Dominic immediately noticed her expression. We can leave. No. Grace knelt and carefully lifted the photograph. I've spent 6 years wondering why Mom was always afraid. I'm not leaving her truth buried because someone wants me scared. Dominic crouched beside her instead of ordering her away. Then tell me where she would hide something nobody else could find. Grace stared at the photograph. Elena stood beside a younger Grace in their old bakery kitchen, both covered in flour. Then Grace remembered. The recipe box. She hurried toward the kitchen cabinet and pulled down a battered wooden box she had kept after her mother died. Beneath handwritten recipes for apple pie and cinnamon rolls was a false wooden panel. Grace lifted it. Inside rested a small memory card and a folded letter with her name written across the front. Her hands trembled. Dominic stayed several feet away. Do you want me here? He asked. Grace looked at him, then nodded. Together they opened the files. Elena had preserved financial records, names, dates, and recorded conversations, proving Richard had spent nearly 2 decades secretly exploiting Moretti businesses and manipulating people around Antonio. It was the missing evidence Dominic's attorneys needed. But Grace barely looked at the documents after opening her mother's letter. Elena had written only 1 page. She told Grace that kindness was not weakness, that dignity could survive cruelty, and that she hoped her daughter would never make herself smaller just to make other people comfortable. Tears rolled down Grace's cheeks. Dominic quietly removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, just as he had outside the diner. He didn't tell her to stop crying. He simply remained beside her until she was ready to stand. By sunrise, Richard Vale and Victor Hale were in custody, and the evidence had been turned over to the proper authorities. Antonio's trust was secured, his doctors confirmed he would recover fully, and Dominic permanently removed Richard from every Moretti business. But Grace expected that to be the end of her involvement with the Morettis. She was wrong. 3 days later, Dominic took her to the Langford Hotel. Grace stopped outside the entrance. "Why are we here?" "Because you lost something here." Her expression hardened. "Dominic, I don't want you buying me a job." "Good." He opened the door for her. "Because I didn't." Inside waited the hotel's regional director, who had learned that Grace's interview had been fraudulently manipulated. They offered her a legitimate rescheduled interview, not employment, not charity, just the opportunity she should have received. Grace looked at Dominic. "You arranged this?" "I corrected a stolen choice. What happens next is yours." 2 weeks later, Grace earned the position herself. Months passed. Dominic never asked her to become quieter, thinner, softer, or easier for his world to accept. He remembered how she took her coffee. He called when she worked late but never demanded she leave. When powerful people stared at her beside him, Dominic didn't hide her, he reached for her hand. And Grace slowly discovered that beneath the feared Mafia Boss was a lonely man who had spent years believing love always came with a price. She taught him otherwise simply by remaining herself. One warm spring evening, Antonio invited them to dinner. Sunlight poured through the windows where red emergency lights had once flashed. Dominic stood beside Grace, no distance between them now. "My father says you saved his life," he murmured. "Twice." Grace smiled. "Your father exaggerates. He also says I should stop pretending you didn't save mine." Grace looked up. For once, Dominic Moretti had no intimidating answer, no calculated move, no wall between them. He simply held out his hand and let her decide. Grace placed hers in it. The woman who once believed the world saw only what it could criticize finally understood that she had never needed to shrink to deserve a place in it. She had missed one interview because she refused to abandon a stranger in the rain, and found a career, a family, and a man powerful enough to protect her, but wise enough to respect her choices. And Dominic found something his money and reputation had never been able to buy. Someone he could trust with the man beneath the power. Sometimes the opportunity we lose while doing the right thing isn't the end of our story. It's the doorway to the life waiting beyond it. So what would you have done if you were Grace that rainy morning, gone to the dream interview, or stopped to help the elderly stranger? Tell us in the comments, and if you believe kindness can change a life when we least expect it, subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, love, and unexpected second chances.